Today, I want to start with something that might be difficult to hear if you are someone who found meaning in a spiritual community or a spiritual teacher. The path that was supposed to free you can become another cage. And not because the original teaching was false, not because every teacher is a predator or every community is a cult. Most of the people involved in these spaces are genuinely seeking, genuinely in pain, genuinely hungry for something real. The problem is subtler than that. And because it is subtle, it is far more dangerous. There is a pattern that runs through spiritual communities of almost every variety: traditional and modern, Eastern and Western, esoteric and mainstream. A pattern where the very structures that were built to support inner freedom begin quietly and incrementally to undermine it, where authority moves outward rather than inward, where doubt becomes pathologized, where belonging becomes conditional on compliance, and the living truth that once ignited everything becomes crystallized into a doctrine that must be defended. If you have ever felt more confused, more dependent, or more diminished after engaging with a spiritual path than before, then this video is for you. My name is Jonathan. Welcome back to my channel, Alchemy of Remembrance. Every genuine spiritual tradition began with a direct experience. Let me start with that. Someone had a profound encounter with reality, with the ground of being, with the divine, with truth that was undeniable and transforming. And from that encounter, teachings emerged, practices, a community, and eventually an institution. The movement from direct experience to an institutional form is not inherently corrupt. The transmission of genuine insight across generations is one of the most valuable things human civilization does. Lineages can carry wisdom that individual lifetimes are too short to rediscover. But something happens in that movement that is almost inevitable without constant self examination. The living experience, which was always particular, always personal, always pointing beyond itself, becomes codified. Codification is the attempt to capture the living stream in language, in ritual, in doctrine, and language, however careful, always reduces what it tries to contain. Once the codification happens, the next step follows almost automatically. The code begins to be protected. Because if the code is wrong or incomplete or needs questioning, then the authority of those who hold and transmit the code is threatened. And institutions, like all living systems, prioritize their own survival. It starts becoming an egregore. So the protection of the doctrine gradually becomes more important than the discovery of the truth that the doctrine was originally pointing toward. Questioning becomes discouraged. The institution's reputation becomes worth protecting at the expense of individual members' well being, and eventually power consolidates at the top. What began as a river of living water gradually becomes a closed circuit, and those inside the circuit, often genuinely devoted people who entered the tradition with sincerity, may not even notice the change because the emotional and social rewards of belonging feel like a spiritual reward. The two become confused. The psychological harm that can result from this is real, measurable, and still significantly underdiagnosed. The term religious trauma syndrome was introduced by psychologist Marlene Winell to describe the cluster of symptoms that can emerge from living or being harmed within high control religious environments. The symptoms are strikingly similar to those of complex PTSD, difficulty trusting one's own perceptions, pervasive shame and guilt that feel sourceless and all encompassing, difficulty making decisions, especially about values and ethics, because the capacity for independent moral reasoning was outsourced for so long that it atrophied: fear of the future, of death, of divine punishment, grief for the community, the identity, the certainty that was lost. And then there is something even more insidious, a kind of epistemological vertigo, when you have been taught for years to distrust your own inner knowing, to measure the validity of your perceptions against an external authority, and then that authority collapses or fails you, you are left without an inner compass. You do not know how to know anything anymore. This is not only a problem of fundamentalist religions, it appears in subtler forms, in New Age communities, in yoga lineages, in healing circles, in contemporary spiritual influencer followings, anywhere that the implicit message is your direct inner experience is not reliable. You need us to interpret it for you. That message, however it is packaged, however gently it is delivered, is the seed of captivity. Because the moment you believe that your inner authority is suspect and only outer authority can be trusted, sovereignty has been surrendered, and the false game, the egregore, has found another player to keep trapped in the matrix. Now, I want to be precise about what I mean by false light, because the term can sound like a conspiracy, as if every spiritual teacher is a con artist or every lineage is a trap. No, that is not what I am saying. False light is not usually an intentional deception. More often, it is the product of genuine spiritual experience combined with an unhealed ego. A teacher has a real opening, a genuine expansion of consciousness, a real encounter with something beyond the ordinary self. And then the ego, rather than being dissolved by that opening, regroups around it. It incorporates the spiritual experience into a new and more elaborately defended identity. And now the inflation of the ego has a sacred authority. If you notice carefully, the signs are actually consistent across traditions and cultures. False light always produces hierarchy. It separates people into the awakened and the asleep, the light workers and the unawakened masses, the chosen lineage and those outside it, etc., etc. These distinctions do not liberate, they actually consolidate the ego at a collective level. False light always requires a mediator. The message becomes, you cannot access the truth directly. You need this teacher, this practice, this initiation, this lineage, this membership, this yantra, and so on. Genuine transmission of light always points beyond itself, but false light always points back to itself. Besides, false light almost always generates emotional dependency. Students begin to feel that they cannot function, cannot make decisions, and cannot access their own guidance without the teacher's input. The relationship that was supposed to support individuation produces instead the opposite, a deep relational dependence where the student's autonomy slowly dissolves. And perhaps most tellingly, false light cannot tolerate scrutiny. Questions are often reframed as spiritual failures. Critical thinking is positioned as the ego resisting transformation. Doubt is treated as a sign of insufficient devotion rather than as a healthy faculty that any genuine path should welcome and refine. I want to speak now directly about the teacher-student relationship, because it is one of the most powerful and one of the most potentially harmful dynamics in the spiritual world. A genuine teacher is rare. I say this from my own experience, not because gifted people do not exist, but because genuine transmission requires not just spiritual depth, but also psychological integration. A teacher who has had some spiritual experiences but has not done deep psychological work is in many ways more dangerous than one who has had neither, because unintegrated psychological wounds do not disappear in the wake of a sudden spiritual experience. Rather, they often get supercharged by it. The unhealed narcissistic injury, the deep shame, the need for specialness, the craving for validation, they do not automatically evaporate. They often simply find a more elaborate and more protected expression. But in actuality, real spiritual practices will make you confront these shadow sides first. And only after addressing them can one reach the enlightened self or the transcendental consciousness. This step is inescapable. But how many of these self proclaimed gurus these days have actually gone through such depths? Have they met their own demons within? Spirituality these days, sadly, has transformed into a huge business to exploit people's vulnerability and to keep them hooked into false narratives and hopes. And ultimately, through these, they are acting as pawns of the archons, the false matrix that resists true inner knowing, true ascension, and the 5D shift. And then you have the teachers who genuinely believe in their own infallibility, who cannot receive feedback or acknowledge limitations without experiencing it as an existential threat, who gradually, incrementally reorganizes the community around the project of maintaining their own image, who, when someone leaves, experiences it not as a natural completion of a relationship, but as a betrayal to be punished. The students drawn to such teachers are often, though not always, people with their own histories of emotional dependency, people searching for the parent who finally gets it right, people whose fawn response has prepared them for exactly this dynamic. They bring their unhealed wounds, the teacher brings theirs, and together they create something that can feel intensely meaningful and be simultaneously quite harmful. But the antidote here is not cynicism about teachers. Genuine guidance exists, and genuine teachers exist too. The antidote here is discernment, watching not what the teacher says about themselves, but what the relationship produces over time in the student. Does the student grow more capable, more self trusting, more free, or more dependent, more afraid, more defined by their membership? That's the litmus test. Now, for those who have been harmed by these dynamics, and there are far more of you than the spiritual world acknowledges, the path back to yourself begins with what might sound like a very simple thing. But in my experience, it is not simple. It is perhaps one of the deepest work there is. It begins with learning to trust your own inner knowing again, not blind trust, not the arrogance of thinking you are always right, but the foundational recognition that your direct experience of reality is valid, that your discomfort in a situation is real information and an indication, that your doubt about a teaching is not a spiritual failure but a signal worth examining, that the still, quiet voice inside you that kept saying something is wrong even when everything around you was insisting you must be the problem, deserves your attention. This is what every genuine path ultimately points toward. In the Vedantic tradition, it is called Atma Guru, the inner teacher. In the Gnostic tradition, it is the pneumatic spark that carries its own direct knowing. In Jungian psychology, it is individuation, the development of a psyche that is genuinely one's own, not borrowed from the collective. The names differ. The direction is always the same, inward. The purpose of a genuine external teacher is to help you find your way to the inner one. If the external teacher is not serving that purpose, if they are positioning themselves as the permanent authority rather than a temporary guide, then the relationship has outgrown its usefulness, whatever gifts it once offered. Leaving a community that harmed you or that no longer serves your growth is not a failure. It is not betrayal. Remember that. It is often one of the bravest acts of sovereignty a person can take, and the grief that comes with it is real and deserves to be honored. You can grieve the loss of belonging, the loss of certainty, the loss of community, and still know that leaving was right. The spiritual path is real. The longing that drives people into communities and traditions and teachers, that longing is real. It is pointing towards something genuine, I want to be absolutely clear about that. I myself have been drawn to so many, but the structures that form around the spiritual path are ultimately human structures. They carry human shadows. And if those shadows are not examined with honesty, with courage, with the willingness to say this is not right, even when everything around you insists it is, then the path that was supposed to free you can become a very beautiful and very elaborate prison. The measure always is sovereignty. Does this increase your inner freedom or diminish it? That question alone, asked honestly and persistently, is one of the most powerful tools of discernment you have. Next week, we go into one of the most searched and most misunderstood spiritual experiences there is, the dark night of the soul. What it actually is, what it is not, and how to navigate it without losing yourself entirely. I am Jonathan. This is Alchemy of Remembrance. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you in the next one. Have a great day.